The heat pressed down like an extra layer of weight as the 12-man Special Forces squad moved through the dry valley. The late afternoon light was harsh and unbroken, spilling across rock and broken brush. Dust hung in the air, stirred by every step, leaving a faint grit on their tongues and the metallic tang of weapon oil in their mouths. The men advanced in staggered formation, rifles angled low but ready, eyes scanning the narrow corridor ahead. No one spoke louder than a murmur over the radio. When orders came, they were short and quiet, just enough to shift the formation or mark a sector. A battered field map, creased and stained from old coffee, passed from one gloved hand to another before being folded again and slipped back into a pouch. The target was a weapons cache tucked into the shells of abandoned farmhouses. Intelligence had marked the site 3 days earlier, confirmed by satellite shots that showed a series of crates under torn roofing. It was a simple mission in outline reach the target. Plant charges. Clear out. But no one on the team treated the word simple as a promise. This was insurgent ground, controlled not by a single unit but by a loose network that knew every rock outcropping and dry gulch. Above the valley mouth, the high ground curved into a natural horseshoe, somewhere up there, far enough to be out of sight. A small shape moved against the ridgeline. Most of the men never saw it. Those who did said nothing, trusting in the squad leader's timing and the mission clock. Their boots crunched over loose gravel and dry twigs. The sound carried oddly in the still air. The light shifted in thin, dusty beams as clouds of grit rolled down from the ridge after each gust. A low, constant hum lingered in the distance, mechanical, but indistinct. The squad leader checked his watch without breaking stride. The second hand ticked with an audible click, marking out the steady rhythm of the approach. Scuffed dog tags swung lightly from the neck of one of the rear flankers, flashing dull silver when they caught the sun. They moved past the first of the decaying farm structures, its roof half collapsed, walls pitted with old bullet marks. Inside, the shadows were thick and unmoving. Through a hole in the far wall, a strip of bright sky cut across a heap of broken plows. The point man slowed only long enough to clear the doorway with a sweep of his barrel before signaling the all clear. Each gesture was precise and economical, the product of repetition rather than conscious thought. Behind him, 2 more soldiers peeled off to cover side angles, boots silent in the fine dust. Overcoms. A faint thread of chatter drifted in. It was another unit, somewhere north, trading updates about possible movement on the high ground. The voices were calm, almost casual, but the details stuck. The squad leader raised his hand for a brief halt, eyes scanning the ridge before motioning forward again. In theory, the valley approach was a calculated risk, a strip of exposure they could cross quickly before curving east toward the objective. In practice, every rock face and brush pile was a blind corner. The air carried the smell of baked earth mixed with the faint sharpness of dried vegetation. Sweat darkened the edges of gloves and the inside of collars. The men adjusted straps and shifted their grips, a subtle rhythm of readiness. The map came out once more for a quick check. A gloved finger traced the path ahead, stopping at a narrow choke point just before the cluster of ruined buildings that marked their target. The plan was to pass through fast, then split into 2 teams, one to plant charges, the other to cover the approach. Somewhere in the far distance, the mechanical hum deepened, followed by a brief, almost imperceptible thud. No one acknowledged it over the net. The team moved again, threading into a section where the valley walls pressed closer together. Here, the light narrowed into sharp angles, shadows stretching long across the path. A hawk circled far above, barely visible against the pale sky, its slow arcs mirroring the squad's steady advance. The sight might have been coincidence, or it might have been the only thing moving in an otherwise too still expanse. The second ridge rose higher on their left, studded with jagged rock that could hide anything from a single spotter to a full team. The point man paused, scanning upward, before giving the signal to close the gap between them. Their footsteps quickened, crunching in unison, rifles angled higher now. Overhead, the hawk tilted once and disappeared behind the ridgeline. The squad leader's watch ticked on, the sound just loud enough for the nearest men to hear. They were minutes from the kill zone, though none of them would have called it that yet. To them, it was still just terrain, another approach, another mission. The concept of controlled exposure was second nature. They knew the risks, but trusted the drill, trusting that their presence was only a dot on a larger map. No one on the ground could see. The battered map, the swinging tags, the steady ticking watch, small anchors of routine in a place where the ground itself seemed to watch them back. They pressed on, unaware of how little ground remained before routine gave way to ruin. The blast hit without warning. One moment the lead vehicle was creeping through the narrow throat of the valley. The next it was gone in a cloud of orange fire and pulverized rock. The roar rolled down the walls like thunder in a canyon, followed by a concussion that punched through the chest and rattled teeth. A rain of hot debris clattered against helmets and armor. The shockwave left a ringing in the ears that made the first shouts sound far away. The radio, alive with low chatter seconds before, dissolved into static and dead air. The squad leader's mouth was moving, but the comm feed was gone, severed as cleanly as the shattered antenna on the burning wreck ahead. The sniper fire began before the smoke even cleared. Sharp, flat cracks cut through the ringing, each shot driving the survivors deeper into the cover of rubble and collapsed wall fragments. Chips of brick and dirt sprayed with every impact. A half-buried rifle lay just ahead, still within the reach of its fallen owner, but no one dared move toward it. The medic broke cover, sprinting low toward a man lying in the open, only to skid into the dirt when a round shattered the ground inches from his knee. He crawled the rest of the way, dragging himself beside the wounded soldier as rounds punched into the dust around them. Two men tried to push around the flank, moving fast between cover points. They never made it past the first gap. Both went down almost instantly, one folding silently, the other twisting mid-stride before hitting the ground hard. The rest of the team could only watch, pressed into whatever shelter they could find as the kill zone closed around them. Smoke grenades popped, spilling white plumes into the air, but a crosswind swept them sideways, leaving the valley floor exposed. Through the shifting haze came flashes of movement, dark shapes darting between rock faces, the glint of scopes, the silhouettes of insurgents repositioning with practiced ease. The heat from the blast still hung in the air, mixing with the acrid bite of burning fuel. Dust swirled with smoke, cutting visibility to just a few meters. Every movement was made in blind bursts, a dash to a new fragment of cover, a pause to scan for muzzle flash. The surviving soldiers' faces were streaked with grit and sweat, eyes narrowed against the sting. One man's cracked helmet visor was coated in a film of dust, the fracture lines catching the light. Radio calls came in broken fragments, barely intelligible through the static. Words like pinned, down, need, and contact bled in and out. Never a complete sentence, never a plan. Overhead, the sky was a pale wash of light, but no support came. Anti-air batteries were active in the region, and GPS jamming meant no one could lock a precise strike without risking friendly casualties. The squad was on its own, cut off, shrinking into the pockets of ground the enemy hadn't yet claimed. Rounds ricocheted off walls with a sharp metallic snap, throwing up splinters of stone and clods of dirt. A bloodied field dressing lay caught on a broken rebar spike, fluttering weakly in the hot updraft from the burning vehicle. Every attempt to shift position brought fresh fire. The medic worked over the wounded man with his back to the fire, his hands moving quickly, voice low but urgent. Another survivor leaned against a fragment of wall, chest heaving, his rifle steady on a narrow gap where he'd last seen movement. Minutes stretched into something harder to measure. 9 soldiers were gone now, their absence felt in the sudden lack of voices, the gaps in the formation that could never be filled. The three who remained were scattered and pinned, each one anchored in place by the certainty that moving meant dying. Dust clung to their gear, grit grinding between teeth. The narrowing circle was both literal and felt space closing in, options dwindling, the weight of survival pressing heavier with every passing second. Somewhere beyond the haze, the enemy was tightening the noose, shifting angles, finding new lines of fire. The survivors kept their rifles up, eyes scanning, muscles locked in readiness, knowing that holding the ground was no longer a question of mission success. It was simply the only thing left to do. Captain Jordan Vale had been in the air for just over 40 minutes when the first fragments bled through her headset. The AH-64D longbow Apache hummed beneath her, steady and familiar, its displays painting the escort route ahead. Her eyes were on the ridgeline markers when the static sharpened, cutting in with a garbled voice that made her pause. It was rough with pain and distance, the signal fractured by terrain and interference. Words came in bursts pinned. Contact. Casualties. Then the line cracked, went silent, and returned with a single sentence, the tone thick with finality. Tell her. Rainfire. The words landed heavier than any command. She didn't need to ask who her was. Call sign Talon 1 had carried weight in these valleys long before today, and whoever sent that message knew it. Her assigned mission, an escort for a supply convoy moving along a separate corridor, suddenly felt far from where she needed to be. She checked her navigation display, saw the clean line of her current route, and then powered it down. The HUD dimmed, leaving only the soft green glow of essential flight data on her visor. Her left hand steadied on the collective, her right adjusting the cyclic to dip the Apache's nose. The engine pitch shifted, a deeper, throatier sound as she descended toward the valley floor. With the main navigation offline, she let muscle memory and the mental map from past sorties take over. She could see the terrain in her mind as clearly as any satellite image, where the canyons narrowed, where the ridges dipped low, where an enemy team might hide a man-pads or sniper position. A dust streak had crept across the upper edge of her canopy from earlier crosswinds. She wiped it away with a gloved knuckle, the gesture more reflex than distraction. The cockpit smelled faintly of heated electronics and oil, a scent she always associated with the start of something serious. On her knee, the laminated kneeboard bore handwritten terrain notes from an operation 6 months back: altitudes, ingress routes, known danger points. A worn unit patch sat tucked into the cockpit's side pocket, its edges frayed from years of service. Threat indicators flickered briefly on one of the darkened displays before she killed the feed. She didn't need the electronic warnings to tell her the obvious. She was flying nap of the earth now, hugging the ground to stay under radar sweeps, skimming just above rock spines and dry riverbeds. The sun was dropping behind the western ridge, casting long shadows that made the contours sharper. Every pass between two peaks like slipping through a closing door. Her breathing stayed slow and controlled, each inhale matched to a scan of her surroundings. In the canyons, the air was warmer and smelled faintly of dust, and the Apache's rotors sent eddies swirling behind her. She adjusted pitch to slip through a narrow pass. Rock walls, flashing close on either side. Somewhere ahead, insurgent spotters were scanning the skies for exactly this kind of approach. She kept her profile low, speed high enough to be unpredictable but steady enough for control. In her mind, the path to the pinned squad was narrowing to a single clear objective. Every turn of the cyclic, every adjustment of altitude was another step toward them. The decision to break from her assigned mission had been made in less than 10 seconds. But it wasn't reckless. She had calculated the risk as she always did, weighing what could be lost if she stayed against what could be saved if she went. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, men were trapped in a kill zone, and she was the only one close enough to reach them. Eyes on the hunt, she murmured under her breath, not as a mantra, but as a reminder. Her focus tightened to the stretch of air ahead, the Apache an extension of her will. The last transmission still echoed in her ears, heavy and unshakable. Rain fire. She intended to do exactly that. The ridgelines ahead were little more than jagged silhouettes behind a veil of shifting dust. Shelling earlier in the day had ripped the topsoil loose, and every gust sent fresh clouds rolling over the high ground. The Apache's rotors stirred the haze into tight spirals as Captain Jordan Vale slipped along the canyon floor. Skimming so low the shadow of her blades seemed to drag across the rock. Inside the cockpit, the hum and vibration were constant, a physical pressure in her chest and forearms as she kept the cyclic steady. Thermal optics flickered on her visor, spitting out ghost images that shimmered in and out of existence. Heat rising from sun-baked stone warped the readings, creating false positives that would have tempted a less experienced pilot to fire prematurely. Vale ignored them, letting her eyes shift between bare visual scans and the faint overlays on her display. She had been here before and knew how the terrain lied. The real threats moved differently, quick darts from shadow to shadow, the subtle ripple of men shifting positions. Her gaze caught the pattern near the head of the valley. It was deliberate, an L-shaped formation angling toward an unseen center point. RPG teams, at least two, setting up a crossfire that could gut her approach. Above them, radar sweeps pulsed from a fixed emplacement, invisible, but felt as her warning lights blinked a sharp red. She killed the emissions feed again, slipping behind a sheer wall of rock just before the sweep could lock. The fuel gauge was already edging lower than she liked, the needle hovering in a range that meant no wasted motion. Every maneuver had to serve a purpose. She calculated a new vector in her head, adjusting altitude by single meters to stay below the radar cone. Her hands worked without wasted motion, left on the collective to manage lift. Right fine-tuning the cyclic to line up with the next break in the ridge. A sudden blast of wind tore through the canyon from the west, shoving at the Apache's flank. The nose dipped, and the left skid came within meters of scraping the wall. Vale banked hard into the gust, letting it push her through the turn instead of fighting it. Dust roared past the canopy, streaking across her helmet visor in a film she wiped away with a quick swipe of her glove. Out in the open stretches between canyon arms, the sense of exposure was almost physical. She could picture spotters with binoculars tracking her every move from the higher ridges. Somewhere behind one of those lenses, someone was making the same mental calculations she was. Except their objective was to kill her. A dust trail in the distance marked an insurgent truck convoy moving fast toward the fight, but she let the targeting reticle pass over them without locking. The convoy wasn't the immediate problem. The RPG teams in the ambush were. The light shifted as the sun slid lower, throwing long blades of shadow across the rock. She used them as cover, flying in and out of alternating dark and glare so her silhouette was never steady. Rotor wash kicked up debris in narrow passes, leaving a wake of swirling grit behind her. The canyon walls funneled the sound of her rotors forward, amplifying it, making it seem like she was closer than she was. It was a small advantage, but in contested airspace, even a few seconds of misjudgment from the enemy could mean survival. Every movement felt like threading a needle, the path ahead narrowing with each choice she made. One wrong turn into open sky could bring her into the line of a heat seeker. Too tight a pass in the canyons and she would bleed off speed she might need to evade. She kept the Apache flowing forward, weaving between the limits of what the machine could do and what the situation demanded. The enemy's ambush lines were tightening. Vale's approach would have to be exact, her timing precise. She could feel the battle just ahead, pressing against the horizon, and she intended to break into it before the trap fully closed. Captain Jordan Vale eased the Apache higher for a brief second, just enough to crest the ridge and confirm what her instincts had already told her. The ridgeline was lined with sniper nests, dug deep into the rock and half hidden by tarps the same color as the dust. Her HUD blinked red target confirmations in her visor. Her breathing slowed to match her trigger rhythm, one burst at a time. The chain gun spat fire, the heavy thump, thump, thump reverberating through the cockpit. Tracers tore into the nests, muzzle flashes strobing from inside the smoke before vanishing in silence. She pivoted, banking hard, and caught the flicker of insurgents scattering between stone walls below. The Apache roared through the canyon, her rotor shadow rippling over the survivors' position. Vale saw them through the dust, 3 figures pinned behind rubble, their rifles lifting as they realized they weren't alone anymore. The call sign Talon 1 glowed on her comm panel. But she didn't key the mic. Her work would speak for itself. She rolled left into a wide curve, pulling her nose onto the first of the technical trucks hurtling toward the fight. A ripple of Hydra rockets streaked out, bright arcs cutting through the brown haze. The explosions swallowed the trucks in fire, a cracked optics lens tumbling end over end in the blast wave before shattering on the ground. Her eyes never lingered. She was already shifting to the weapons cache marked in her kneeboard notes. The structure was little more than a cluster of battered walls, but she knew the crates inside could feed the fight for months if left untouched. She armed the Hellfires, steadying the cyclic. The missiles leapt away with a kick she felt through her seat, their trails carving clean white scars across the dust-heavy air. The cache erupted in a deep, rolling detonation, debris flung high into the light. Static broke in her headset one of the pinned soldiers, voice rough but alive. The last Talon. She's here. The name caught her off guard, but only for a second. She didn't answer. The sky ahead was already shifting with new threats. From the corner of her visor, a targeting cue flared. An RPG team had just popped from cover. They were closer than she liked, the tube already rising toward her. She pushed the Apache into a dive, rotors clawing at the air, skimming so low her skids almost kissed the ridge face. A sharp pull on the cyclic swung her around the canyon wall, breaking the team's line of sight. A single RPG streaked past in her wake, its contrail dissolving into nothing. She climbed again, using the rock to mask her approach, and burst into the open above them. Her chain gun roared, precise bursts tearing through the crew before they could reload. One claw strike, final and absolute. Below, the fight was unraveling for the insurgents. Fighters sprinted between alleys, dragging weapons, trying to melt into the maze of stone. Vale kept the pressure constant. She worked methodically, each pass stripping away another layer of the ambush. Rockets for vehicles. Gunfire for entrenched positions. Hellfires for the fortified holdouts. Every shot was measured, the sequence as natural to her as breathing. Her ammo counters ticked down in quiet agreement with her fuel gauge, which was now dipping lower than she liked. Through the shifting dust, she glimpsed the medevac bird inbound, its rotors just visible over the southern ridge. She swung wide to clear its approach, strafing the far ridge to silence any last pockets of fire. Spent shell casings spun in the cockpit light as they ejected, clattering against the fuselage before dropping into the air. Her breathing stayed even, the calm in her voice a mirror of her control. The wounded were moving now, lifted and carried toward the pickup zone under the shadow of her orbit. Rotor wash from her passes kicked grit into the air, a curtain between the survivors and the enemy regrouping beyond the kill zone. She saw one of the men glance up at her on each pass, the nod in his posture a silent acknowledgement. In the dust and light, her shadow swept over them again. The battle wasn't over. There were still rifles on the far edges, still shapes shifting in the heat shimmer, but the ground beneath the squad was theirs again. Every strike she'd made had been the claw's single blow, decisive, final, unrelenting. As the medevac lifted, Vale kept her orbit, watching for any last threat. The name they'd given her over comms still hung in her mind. The last Talon. She'd never asked for it, never wanted to be anything other than the one who got the job done. But here, in the smoke and heat, it felt like a promise. Her fuel light blinked amber. Time to go. She rolled the Apache into a final pass over the field, rotors thundering, the dust and shadow swallowing the last of the enemy's will to fight. Only then did she pull away, leaving the ground to the men she'd saved. Behind her, the battlefield lay scarred and silent, marked by the precision of her wrath. The courtyard was little more than a rectangle of cracked stone and dust, hemmed in by walls that had been half destroyed long before the ambush began. The 3 surviving soldiers crouched behind the tallest section, their rifles braced on crumbling edges as rounds chipped away the stone. From her orbit, Captain Jordan Vale could see the problem immediately: too little cover, too many angles for the enemy to exploit, and no clear path to move without being exposed. She keyed her mic, voice level, but clipped for speed. She gave the Blackhawk's pilot a heading and altitude, her eyes on the open sliver between 2 leaning buildings that would serve as the only viable approach. Her left hand adjusted the cyclic for a tighter orbit. With her right, she pulled a smoke marker from its bracket and popped it through the open vent. The dye blossomed below, thick red coils twisting in the wind, drifting just enough to mark the landing zone without smothering visibility. The Blackhawk's shadow slid into view, rotors biting the air. Its wash met hers, and the courtyard filled with a constant churn of grit and paper scraps. Vale's HUD tracked the outlines of insurgents moving through the alleys, their advance measured but relentless. She rolled into a firing run, the chain gun barking short, precise bursts. 2 shapes went down behind a wall, another spun out of sight. She climbed just enough to clear the Blackhawk's descent path, then banked hard to bring her nose around for the next pass. Her fuel light flashed amber, the reflection glancing off her visor in steady pulses. She ignored it. Over comms, her tone sharpened as she called ranges and bearing for the incoming threats. The ground team's replies nearly drowned by the roar of the rotors. Medics hit the ground running, stretcher straps snapping taut as they loaded the first casualty. The second was half dragged, half carried, boots kicking up arcs of dust. Enemy fire thickened from the north wall. Vale dropped low, barely above rooftop height, and let the cannon tear into the source. Shards of brick and corrugated tin burst outward, the alley going still under the rain of debris. She swung wide again, always keeping the Blackhawk in sight. The unwritten rule clear she would not break orbit until the last man was aboard. The final survivor was moving now, his arm over a medic's shoulders. Behind them, shadows spilled into the street, an enemy push timed for the moment of liftoff. Vale's gun camera locked on, the feed showing muzzle flashes through the haze. She pulled the trigger in steady pulses, walking the fire toward the lead man. The charging line broke apart, bodies scattering for cover. The medic and his charge disappeared into the helicopter's open door. "LZ clear," she called, voice flat, and pulled into a climb as the Blackhawk lifted. The combined rotor wash turned the courtyard into a solid wall of dust, swallowing the outlines of the buildings. Through it, she could just see the Blackhawk's tail swinging toward its escape vector. She held her orbit for another 10 seconds, watching for anything left moving on the ground. Only when the medevac was clear of small arms range did she break away, banking into the sun's low glare. The fuel light blinked steadily in her periphery, but the sound of her rotors filled the cockpit, steady and strong. As the dust settled behind her, the courtyard lay empty, marked only by the red coil of smoke still drifting skyward. Captain Jordan Vale stayed with the medevac bird until the last blip on her threat display faded and the ridges gave way to open sky. Only then did she peel off, banking toward base with the fuel gauge needle pressed against its stop. Below, the Blackhawk's rotors faded into distance, carrying the 3 survivors who sat in its cabin, leaning back with eyes closed, but hands still wrapped around their rifles. None of them knew if she was still in the air. They spoke in low voices, one name passing between them like a quiet anchor: the last Talon. The air cooled as night settled over the base. Her Apache dropped into the pattern without fanfare, skids touching the tarmac in a gentle bounce. The engine spooled down with a long, fading whine. Under the floodlights, Dust clung to the fuselage in streaks, settling in the seams like a second skin. The call sign Talon 1 glowed faintly on her cockpit display until the last system cycled off. The empty fuel gauge needle rested hard against the pin. Vale popped the canopy, pulling her helmet free. The crew chief stepped forward, grease-stained gloves catching it without a word. She gave him a single nod, then stepped down, boots striking the tarmac with a solid, final sound. There were no cameras, no waiting officers, just the quiet shuffle of ground crew moving around the flight line. Later, in the dim after-action review room, the only light came from the screens. Faces were half lit as the black box recording played, static-laced voices cutting in and out. Then, through the distortion, came the line in a voice already slipping toward the edge. "Tell her, rain, fire." No one spoke when it ended. The blinking light on the recorder was the only movement in the room. Outside, the night was still. The rotors had stopped turning, but the echo of their rhythm seemed to linger in the air, faint and steady. Somewhere in the dark, the story of what happened in that valley was already taking shape, passed in fragments and half-truths. Vale didn't need to hear it. She knew how legends started quietly, without the subject ever claiming the name.